Phuoc Tuy Province, South Vietnam, April 1969. Captain Mike Walsh crouched motionless in the elephant grass, watching the 4 Australian SAS troopers prepare for their patrol. They moved like water, silent, fluid, inevitable. No talking, just hand signals so subtle Walsh almost missed them. One trooper adjusted his pack with movements so deliberate it seemed choreographed. Another checked his L1A1 rifle, fingers dancing across the weapon without looking down. Walsh had been embedded with the Australian Special Air Service Regiment for 2 weeks now, part of a U.S. Army Special Operations Assessment Team. His orders were clear: observe, learn, replicate. The Pentagon wanted to understand why these 50-man Australian patrols were achieving kill ratios the American forces could only dream of. 10 to 1, 20 to 1, sometimes more. He'd watched them train, studied their tactics, interviewed their officers. But watching them work was something else entirely. The lead scout, a lean corporal from Perth, caught Walsh's eye and gave an almost imperceptible nod. The patrol melted into the jungle. One moment they were there, the next gone. No broken branches, no disturbed leaves, no sound. Walsh waited 30 seconds, then tried to follow. His boot snapped a twig on his second step. The Australians were already 300 meters ahead, invisible. Back at base camp that night, Walsh would write in his report, "We can train for years. We can study their manual. We can copy their equipment. But we cannot become them." He didn't know it yet, but the Pentagon would spend the next 3 years trying to prove him wrong. They would fail. When the first Australian SAS squadron arrived in Vietnam in 1966, American military brass viewed them with polite curiosity at best, mild skepticism at worst. Another Allied contingent, more Commonwealth troops to add to the coalition numbers. The Australians brought 120 men to a war, consuming 500,000 Americans. "We appreciated the political gesture," recalled Colonel James Patterson, U.S. Army Special Forces, in a 1989 interview. "But honestly, we thought, what can 100 guys do? We've got entire divisions here." The Australian approach seemed almost quaint to American planners. Small patrols, 4 to 6 men, long-range reconnaissance missions lasting 2 to 3 weeks. Extreme noise discipline, no artillery support, no airstrikes unless absolutely necessary. They insisted on small unit autonomy, minimal command interference, and operational techniques that seemed to violate every principle of American military doctrine. They wanted to walk through the jungle for weeks without backup, recalled Major General William Dupuy. In 1966, that struck us as either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. American strategy in Vietnam centered on firepower and mobility. Search and destroy, body counts. If you found the enemy, you called in artillery, gunships, fast movers. You brought overwhelming force. The helicopter had revolutionized warfare. Why would anyone choose to walk? The Australians walked. More importantly, they hunted. They didn't search and destroy. They stalked, tracked, ambushed. "We're not looking for a fair fight," explained Captain Bob Kearney, SAS. "We're looking for the enemy's patrol before he knows we exist. Then we destroy him completely and disappear." This philosophy confused American observers. "It seemed almost unsporting," admitted Captain David Hackworth, a legendary U.S. Army officer. "But then we saw the results." In their first 6 months in Phuoc Tuy Province, the Australian SAS conducted operations with kill ratios exceeding 21-1. They were capturing weapons caches, documenting enemy movements, and eliminating high-value targets with a success rate that seemed statistically impossible. By early 1967, that polite curiosity had transformed into intense interest. The Pentagon wanted answers, How were 100 men achieving what thousands couldn't? What made them so effective? And most importantly, could we do it too? The answer to that last question would prove far more complicated than anyone anticipated. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment traced its lineage to the British SAS, born in the North African desert in 1941. While American Special Operations evolved from Rangers, OSS, and unconventional warfare units, the SAS developed something different. A fusion of deep reconnaissance, surgical strikes, and psychological operations that required almost monastic dedication to craft. "Selection doesn't end," explained Sergeant McDeek. "You're always being assessed, always proving yourself. The regiment has no room for individuals who can't subordinate ego to mission." Australian SAS selection in the 1960s took 6 months. The failure rate exceeded 80%. Candidates needed to demonstrate not just physical endurance, but cognitive flexibility, tactical creativity, and psychological resilience under conditions designed to break them. They learned tracking skills from Aboriginal guides, studied jungle survival with Malayan veterans, trained in long-range navigation, field medicine, communications, demolitions, and languages. By the time a trooper earned his Sandy Beret, he'd spent more time learning than most soldiers spend in their first enlistment, noted Lieutenant Colonel John Salmon, who commanded the squadron from 1966-1967. When the Australian government committed forces to Vietnam, the SAS was tasked with reconnaissance operations in Phuoc Tuy Province, 100 kilometers east of Saigon. The area was Viet Cong territory, dense jungle, extensive tunnel networks, and a population that ranged from sympathetic to actively hostile. The first Australian task force needed intelligence. The SAS would provide it. Their operational doctrine differed fundamentally from American practices. Patrols inserted by helicopter at dusk, often kilometers from their actual operational area. They moved at night, using terrain to mask their movement. During daylight, they observed, every 2 days, brief radio contact, coded, compressed, minimal. "We might walk 50 kilometers in a week and not fire a shot," recalled Trooper Dave Morrell. "But we'd map every trail, count every enemy patrol, identify every cache. Then, when the time was right, we'd set an ambush that would devastate them." The ambush became their signature. Unlike American practice, which often involved hasty ambushes with massive firepower, the SAS planned meticulously. They'd track an enemy patrol for days, learning patterns, identifying leaders, counting weapons. Then they'd select terrain that offered no escape, positioning themselves for overlapping fields of fire, usually within 20 meters of the killing zone. The first burst killed the lead and tail simultaneously, explained Corporal Jim Truscott. The rest were caught in a box with nowhere to go. 15 seconds, maybe 20. Then silence. We'd police the area, take intelligence materials, and be gone in under 2 minutes. By mid-1967, American Special Operations Command was paying attention. Operation Marsden, February 24, 1967. The patrol that changed everything began unremarkably. Sergeant Bob Botel led 5 troopers into the Long High Hills, tracking reports of a Viet Cong battalion command element. The Australian SAS had been operational for 8 months. American assessment teams were finally getting permission to observe their techniques firsthand. Captain Mike Walsh accompanied them. He would later call it the most educational week of my military career. For 3 days, Botel's patrol moved through terrain that American units would have considered impenetrable without engineer support. They crossed streams by feeling for rocks underwater rather than splashing through. They climbed ridges by following animal trails that left minimal trace. At night, they lay in ambush positions for hours, absolutely motionless, waiting for enemy patrols that sometimes never materialized. The discomfort was indescribable, Walsh recalled. Rain, insects, thorns. We couldn't speak, could barely move, but they were reading the jungle like a book. On the fourth morning, Botel found it, a trail junction where 3 paths converged. The earth showed heavy traffic, multiple boot prints, disturbed vegetation, cigarette butts. Fresh, recent, big unit. Botel hand-signed his team into position. Overlapping fields of fire, L1A1 rifles synchronized. Walsh, against regulations, carried an M16. The Australians had advised against it. The weapons report would identify them as Americans if things went wrong. They waited 13 hours. The VC battalion commander walked into the kill zone at 1640 hours, surrounded by staff officers and guards, at least 40 combatants. The odds were insane. 1 Australian patrol against a battalion element. Botel didn't hesitate, Walsh said. The ambush signal was squeezing the hand of the man next to him. It passed down the line faster than thought. The initial burst killed 9 men in 3 seconds. The VC commander fell with the first shot. The patrol's sustained fire created a wall of bullets that disintegrated the enemy formation. Grenades followed, fragmentation and white phosphorus. Chaos, screaming, return fire snapping overhead. 90 seconds, Walsh said. That's how long we fired. Then Botel signaled withdrawal and we disappeared. They moved 2 kilometers in darkness, set a cold camp, and listened to the enemy search for them all night. The VC never came closer than 400 meters. At dawn, the patrol extracted by helicopter from a different location. The body count, 23 confirmed kills, including the battalion commander and 3 staff officers. Captured documents revealed complete operational plans for the next month. Australian casualties, 0. 1 trooper had a bullet graze his pack. When Walsh briefed the results to Special Operations Command, the room went silent. "That's not possible," said a colonel. 6 men don't ambush 40 and walk away clean. "I was there," Walsh replied. "It happened." Operation Ainsley, September 1967. The American attempt to replicate SAS tactics began with Operation Ainsley. U.S. Army Special Forces trained 12 hand-picked teams using Australian methods: small patrols, long-range reconnaissance, ambush doctrine. The Australians provided advisors. Equipment was standardized. Training was intensive. The first American patrol inserted on September 8th. They lasted 30 hours. "We moved too fast, talked too much, and made too much noise," admitted Sergeant First Class Robert Howard, who would later earn the Medal of Honor in Vietnam. "The Australians tried to teach us, but we couldn't internalize it. We'd been trained our whole careers to move with purpose, with aggression. The SAS moved like they were part of the jungle." The patrol compromised its position, called for emergency extraction, and barely escaped a pursuing VC force. No casualties, but also no intelligence and no kills. Other American patrols fared better. Some achieved successful ambushes and reconnaissance missions. But the consistency was missing. The Australians succeeded 85% of the time. American teams hovered around 40%. "It wasn't talent," reflected Colonel Arthur Bull Simons, legendary Special Operations Commander. "It was culture. The SAS built troopers over years. We built operators over months. They refined techniques across decades. We adapted tactics across weeks. They accepted that some things can't be rushed. We believed anything could be overcome with enough determination." The fundamental problem was philosophical. American military culture rewarded aggression, initiative, and decisive action. Australian SAS culture rewarded patience, discipline, and invisible precision. You couldn't reconcile them. By 1968, the Pentagon had shifted strategy. If American forces couldn't become the SAS, perhaps they could learn specific techniques and integrate them into existing special operations doctrine. Joint training programs proliferated. Australian SAS instructors rotated through U.S. Special Forces schools. American teams embedded with SAS patrols for extended periods. Equipment exchanges happened: L1A1 rifles, pack configurations, ration types. Some techniques transferred successfully. American teams adopted the SAS practice of hard routine in patrol bases, absolute silence during danger hours, minimalist equipment, and extreme camouflage discipline. They learned better tracking skills, improved observation techniques, and more sophisticated ambush planning. The Australians taught us to think like hunters instead of soldiers, said Captain Larry Thorne. That changed everything for some units. But the Corps remained elusive. The SAS approach required a level of small unit autonomy that American command culture resisted. Australian patrols operated for weeks with minimal supervision, making tactical decisions that might contradict strategic guidance. They answered to their squadron commander, period. American special operations couldn't escape the hierarchy. Even the most autonomous teams faced multiple layers of command oversight. Radio checks were frequent. Mission parameters were specific. Air support was assumed. "We'd plan a beautiful ambush," recalled MSG Roy Benavidez. "Then command would tell us to coordinate with battalion, get air support on standby, have a QRF ready. By the time we met all requirements, the enemy knew we were coming." The Australians also adapted to American expectations. Joint operations increased in 1969, with SAS patrols coordinating with U.S. units for larger operations. They found ways to bridge the cultural gap, though it meant compromising some of their independence. "We learned their language," explained Lieutenant Michael Jeffrey, later Governor-General of Australia. "We couldn't make them operate like us, so we learned to operate alongside them. Different approaches, common goals." The most successful integration happened with U.S. Navy SEALs and Long-Range Reconnaissance Patrols, LRRPs, who adopted more SAS-like procedures. These units operated in smaller teams with greater autonomy, emphasizing stealth and precision. While never achieving SAS-level consistency, they proved the techniques could work in American hands when properly adapted. "It wasn't that Americans couldn't do it," reflected Trooper John Keneally. "It's that our system was built for it. Theirs wasn't. Culture beats tactics every time." The Australian SAS reached their operational zenith in 1969-1970. Their kill ratios consistently exceeded 25.1. They'd perfected the art of company killer ambushes, small patrols eliminating platoon and company-sized enemy elements with near-perfect precision. Operation Esso. June 1969. A 5-man patrol under Sergeant Keith Payne, who would later earn the Victoria Cross in a different operation, tracked a Viet Cong company for 6 days through the long green jungle. They mapped every campsite, identified leaders, and documented the unit's routine with photographic precision. On day 7, they ambushed the company during a meal break. The initial burst had killed 18 men. The subsequent firefight lasted 4 minutes. Final count: 42 enemy KIA, massive intelligence haul, and, again, 0 Australian casualties. "It should have been impossible," said Captain Walsh, who by 1969 had returned to Vietnam to observe SAS operations again. But they made it look routine. The Americans continued trying. By 1970, U.S. Special Operations kill ratios had improved. Some LRRP units achieved 10-1-1 or better. The lessons were sinking in, but the gap remained. "We got better at being stealthy," admitted Colonel Bob Kingston. "But the Australians were stealthy in their bones. We learned techniques. They lived a philosophy." The psychological impact on the Viet Cong was profound. Australian patrols developed a reputation for near-supernatural abilities. Rung, jungle ghosts. Some VC units refused to operate in areas where the SAS was known to be active. They feared us more than American firepower, recalled Corporal Mick Deek. Firepower you can hide from. We found you anyway. A captured VC political officer's diary, recovered in 1970, included this entry. The Australian commandos are not human. They see without eyes. They move without sound. When they attack, death is certain. We cannot fight them. We can only avoid them. Yet even at peak effectiveness, the SAS never exceeded 120 men in Vietnam. The American Special Operations community, trying to replicate their success, never fully cracked the code. The techniques could be taught. The mindset couldn't be transplanted. The Australian SAS departed Vietnam in 1971, having conducted over 200 patrols with a casualty exchange rate approaching 31, the highest of any Allied unit in the war. American attempts to copy their methods produced mixed results. Improved tactical performance, but never the consistent excellence the Australians demonstrated. We learned that some capabilities can't be replicated, only respected, reflected General William Dupuy in his memoirs. The SAS wasn't just tactics and techniques. It was organizational culture refined over decades. The lessons influenced American Special Operations development for decades. The formation of Delta Force in 1977 incorporated SAS selection methods and small unit autonomy. Long-range surveillance units adopted many patrol techniques, but the fundamental insight remained. Culture shapes capability more than training ever could. Post-war reunions between American and Australian veterans revealed mutual respect. "They taught us how to hunt," said one American LRRP veteran. "We taught them how to call in an airstrike. Different skills for different armies." The Australian SAS became legend. Ghosts the Americans studied, respected, and learned from, but could never quite become. Their success in Vietnam proved that in special operations, the quality of the individual trooper and the culture that shapes him matters more than numbers, firepower, or technological advantage. They weren't just elite soldiers. They were an entirely different species of warrior. Patient, precise, invisible, and utterly lethal. The Americans called them ghosts, not because they couldn't be seen, but because even when watching closely, you still couldn't understand how they did what they did. Some secrets can't be copied. They can only be earned through decades of refinement, selection, and an organizational philosophy that refuses to compromise excellence for expedience. The Australians understood this. The Americans learned it the hard way.